Chapter 4. The Bluecaps. Throughout the grinding of our souls in the gears of the great nighttime institution, when our souls are pulverized and our flesh hangs down in tatters like a beggar's rags, we suffer too much and are too immersed in our own pain to rivet with penetrating and far-seeing gaze those pale night executioners who torture us. A surfeit of inner grief floods our eyes. Otherwise, what historians of our torturers we would be. For it is certain they will never describe themselves as they actually are, but alas, every former prisoner remembers his own interrogation in detail. How they squeezed him, and what foulness they squeezed out of him. But often he does not even remember their names, let alone think about them as human beings. So it is with me. I can recall much more, and much more that's interesting, about any one of my cellmates than I can about Captain of State Security Yezipov, with whom I spent no little time face to face, the two of us alone in his office. There is one thing, however, which remains with us all as an accurate, generalized recollection. Foul rot, a space totally infected with putrefaction. And even when, decades later, we are long past fits of anger or outrage, in our own quieted hearts, we retain this firm impression of low, malicious, impious, and possibly muddled people. There's an interesting story about Alexander II, the Tsar surrounded by revolutionaries, who were to make 7 attempts on his life. He once visited the house of preliminary detention on Spalernaya, the uncle of the big house, where he ordered them to lock him up in solitary confinement cell number 227. He stayed in it for more than an hour, attempting thereby to sense the state of mind of those he had imprisoned there. One cannot but admit that for a monarch this was evidence of a moral aspiration, to feel the need and make the effort to take a spiritual view of the matter. But it is impossible to picture any of our interrogators, right up to Abakumov and Beria, wanting to slip into a prisoner's skin even for 1 hour, or feeling compelled to sit and meditate in solitary confinement. Their branch of service does not require them to be educated people of broad culture and broad views, and they are not. Their branch of service does not require them to think logically, and they do not. Their branch of service requires only that they carry out orders exactly and be impervious to suffering. And that is what they do, and that is what they are. We who have passed through their hands feel suffocated when we think of that legion, which is stripped bare of universal human ideals. Although others might not be aware of it, it was clear to the interrogators at least that the cases were fabricated. Except at staff conferences, they could not seriously say to one another or to themselves that they were exposing criminals. Nonetheless, they kept right on producing depositions, page after page, to make sure that we rotted. So the essence of it all turns out to be the credo of the Blatny, the underworld of Russian thieves, you today, me tomorrow. They understood that the cases were fabricated, yet they kept on working year after year. How could they? Either they forced themselves to not think, and this in itself means the ruin of a human being, and simply accepted that this was the way it had to be, and that the person who gave them their orders was always right. But didn't the Nazis, too, it comes to mind, argue that same way? Or else was it a matter of the progressive doctrine, the granite ideology, an interrogator in the awful Orotukin, sent there lo the Kolyma in 1938 as a penalty assignment? So touched when M. Lurie, former director of the Krivoy Rog Industrial Complex, readily agreed to sign an indictment, which meant a second camp term that he used the time they had, thus saved to say, "You think we get any satisfaction from using persuasion? We have to do what the party demands of us. You are an old party member. Tell me, what would you do in my place?" Apparently Lurie nearly agreed with him, and it may have been the fact that he already had been thinking in such terms that led him to sign so readily. It is, after all, a convincing argument. But most often it was merely a matter of cynicism. The Bluecaps understood the workings of the meat grinder and loved it. In the Zhidos camps in 1944, interrogator Mironenko said to the condemned Bebek with pride and his faultless logic, "Interrogation and trial are merely judicial corroboration. They cannot alter your fate, which was previously decided. If it is necessary to shoot you, then you will be shot even if you are altogether innocent. If it is necessary to acquit you, then no matter how guilty you are, you will be cleared and acquitted. Just give us a person, and we'll create the case." That was what many of them said jokingly, and it was their slogan. What we think of as torture, they think of as good work. The wife of the interrogator, Nikolai Grabyshenko, the Volga Canal Project, said touchingly to her neighbors, "Kolya is a very good worker. One of them didn't confess for a long time, and they gave him to Kolya. Kolya talked with him for one night, and he confessed." What prompted them all to slip into harness and pursue so zealously not truth but totals of the processed and condemned? Because it was the most comfortable for them not to be different from the others. And because these totals meant an easy life, supplementary pay, awards and decorations, promotions in rank, and the expansion and prosperity of the organs themselves. If they ran up high totals, then they could loaf when they felt like it, or do poor work or go out and enjoy themselves at night. And that is just what they did. Low totals led to their being kicked out, to loss of their feed bag. For Stalin could never be convinced that in any district or city or military unit he might suddenly cease to have enemies. That is why they felt no mercy, but instead an explosion of resentment and rage toward those maliciously stubborn prisoners who opposed being fitted into the totals, who would not capitulate to sleeplessness or the punishment cell or hunger. By refusing to confess, they menaced the interrogator's personal standing. It was as though they wanted to bring him down. In such circumstances, all measures were justified. If it's to be war, then war it will be. We'll ram the tube down your throat. Swallow that salt water. Excluded by the nature of their work and by deliberate choice from the higher sphere of human existence, the servitors of the Blue Institution lived in their lower sphere with all the greater intensity and avidity, and there they were possessed and directed by the two strongest instincts of the lower sphere, other than hunger and sex, greed for power and greed for gain. Particularly for power, in recent decades it turned out to be more important than money. Power is a poison well known for thousands of years. If only no one were to ever acquire material power over others. But to the human being who has faith in some force that holds dominion over all of us, and who is therefore conscious of his own limitations, power is not necessarily fatal. For those, however, who are unaware of any higher sphere, it is a deadly poison. For them, there is no antidote. Here, attraction is not the right word. It is intoxication. After all, it is intoxicating. You are still young, still, shall we say, parenthetically, a sniveling youth. Only a little while ago, your parents were deeply concerned about you and didn't know where to turn to launch you in life. You were such a fool you didn't even want to study, but you got through 3 years of that school, and then how you took off and flew, how your situation changed, how your gestures changed, your glance, the turn of your head. The learned council of the Scientific Institute is in session. You enter and everyone notices you and trembles. You don't take the chairman's chair. Those headaches are for the rector to take on. You sit off to one side, but everyone understands that you are the head man there. You are the special department, and you can sit there for just 5 minutes and then leave. You have that advantage over the professors. You can be called away by more important business, but later on, when you're considering their decision, you will raise your eyebrows or, better still, purse your lips and say to the rector, "You can't do that. There are special considerations involved." That's all, and it won't be done. Or else you are an Ozzibist, a state security representative in the army, a smearshman, and a mere lieutenant. But the portly old colonel, the commander of the unit, stands up when you enter the room and tries to flatter you, to play up to you. He doesn't even have a drink with his chief of staff without inviting you to join them. You have a power over all the people in that military unit, or factory, or district, incomparably greater than that of the military commander, or factory director, or secretary of the district Communist Party. These men control people's military or official duties, wages, reputations, but you control the people's freedom. And no one dares speak about you in meetings, and no one will ever dare write about you in the newspaper. Not only something bad, but anything good. They don't dare. Your name, like that of a jealously guarded deity, cannot even be mentioned. You are there, everyone feels your presence, but it's as though you didn't exist. From that moment you don that heavenly blue service cap, you stand higher than the publicly acknowledged power. No one dares check up on what you do, but no one is exempt from your checking up on him. And therefore, in dealing with ordinary so-called citizens, who for you are mere blocks of wood, it is altogether appropriate for you to wear an ambiguous and deeply thoughtful expression. For of course, you are the one, and no one else, who knows about the special considerations, and therefore you are always right. There is just one thing you must never forget. You, too, would have been just such a poor block of wood if you had not had the luck to become one of the little links in the organs, that flexible, unitary organism inhabiting a nation as a tapeworm inhabits a human body. Everything is yours now. Everything is for you. Just be true to the organs. They will always stand up for you. They will always help you swallow up anyone who bothers you. They will help move every obstacle from your path. But be true to the organs. Do everything they order you to do. Do everything they order you to. They will do the thinking for you in respect to your functions, too. The duties of an interrogator require work, of course. You have to come in during the day, at night sit for hours and hours, but not split your skull over proof. Let the prisoner's head ache over that. And you don't have to worry about whether the prisoner is guilty or not, but simply do what the organs require, and everything will be all right. It will be up to you to make the interrogation periods pass as pleasurably as possible and not get overly fatigued. And it would be nice to get some good out of it, at least to amuse yourself. You have been sitting a long time, and all of a sudden a new method of persuasion occurs to you. Eureka! So you call up your friends on the phone, and you go around to the other offices and tell them about it. What a laugh! Who shall we try it on, boys? It's really pretty monotonous to keep doing the same thing all the time. Those trembling hands, those imploring eyes, that cowardly submissiveness. They are really a bore. If you could just get one of them to resist. I love strong opponents. It's such fun to break their backs. And if your opponent is so strong that he refuses to give in, all your methods have failed, and you are in a rage, then don't control your fury. It's tremendously satisfying, that outburst. Let your anger have its way. Don't set any bounds to it. Don't hold yourself back. That's when interrogators spit in the open mouth of the accused and shove his face into a full cuspidor. That's the state of mind in which they drag priests around by their long hair, or urinate in a kneeling prisoner's face. After such a storm of fury, you feel yourself a real honest-to-God man. Or else you are interrogating a foreigner's girlfriend. So you curse her out and then you say, "Come on now, does an American have a special kind of... is it that? Weren't there enough Russian ones for you?" All of a sudden you get an idea. Maybe she learns something from those foreigners. Here's a chance not to be missed, like an assignment abroad. And so you begin to interrogate her energetically. How? What positions? More! In detail. Every scrap of information. You can use the information yourself, and you can tell the other boys, too. The girl is blushing all over and in tears. "It doesn't have anything to do with the case," she protests. "Yes, it does! Speak up!" That's power for you. She gives you the full details. If you want, she'll draw a picture for you. If you want, she'll demonstrate with her body. She has no way out. In your hands you hold the punishment cell and her prison term. And if you have asked for a stenographer to take down the questions and answers, and they send in a pretty one, you can shove your paw down in her bosom right in front of the boy being interrogated. He's not a human being, after all. and there's no real reason to feel shy in his presence. In fact, there's no reason for you to feel shy with anyone. And if you like the broads, and who doesn't, you'd be a fool not to make use of your position. Some will be drawn to you because of your power, and others will give in out of fear. So you've met a girl somewhere and she's caught your eye? She'll belong to you, never fear. She can't get away. Someone else's wife has caught your eye? She'll be yours too, because after all, there's no problem about removing the husband. No, indeed. To know what it meant to be a blue cap, one had to experience it. Anything you saw was yours. Any apartment you looked at was yours. Any woman was yours. Any enemy that was struck from your path. The earth beneath your feet was yours. The heaven above you was yours. It was, after all, like your cap. Sky blue. The passion for gain was their universal passion. After all, in the absence of any checking up, such power is inevitably used for personal enrichment. One would have had to be holy to refrain. If we were able to discover the hidden motivation behind individual arrests, we would be astounded to find that, granting the rules governing arrests in general, 75% of the time the particular choice of whom to arrest, the personal cast of the die, was determined by human greed and vengefulness, and that of 75%, half were the result of material self-interest on the part of the local nkvd, and of course the prosecutor too, for on this point I do not distinguish between them. The motivations and actions of the Bluecaps are sometimes so petty that one can only be astounded. Security officer Senchenko took a map case and dispatch from an officer he'd arrested and started to use them right in his presence, and by manipulating the documentation, he took a pair of foreign gloves from another prisoner. When the armies were advancing, the Bluecaps were especially irritated because they only got second pick of the booty. The counterintelligence officer of the 49th Army who arrested me had a yen for my cigarette case. And it wasn't even a cigarette case, but a small German army box, of a tempting scarlet, however. And because of that piece of shit, he carried out a whole maneuver. As his first step, he omitted it from the list of belongings that were confiscated from me. You can keep it. He thereupon ordered me to be searched again, knowing all the time that it was all I had in my pockets. Aha! What's that? Take it away! And to prevent my protests, put him in the punishment cell. What Tsar's gendarme would have dared behave that way toward a defender of the fatherland? Every interrogator was given an allowance of a certain number of cigarettes to encourage those willing to confess and reward stool pigeons. Some of them kept all the cigarettes for themselves. Even in accounting for hours spent in interrogation, they used to cheat. They got higher pay for night work, and we used to note the way they wrote down more hours on the night interrogations than they really spent. During the Leningrad blockade, interrogator Nikolai Fedorovich Khrushchev told Yelizaveta Viktorovna Strakovic, wife of the prisoner he was interrogating, K.I. Strakovic, "I want a quilt, bring it to me," when she replied, "All of our warm things are in the room they've sealed." He went to her apartment and, without breaking the state security seal on the lock, unscrewed the entire doorknob. "That's how the MGB works," he explained gaily. And he went in and began to collect the warm things, shoving some crystal in his pocket at the same time. She herself tried to get whatever she could out of the room, but he stopped her. "That's enough for your..." And he kept on raking in the booty. There's no end to such cases. One could issue 1,000 white papers, and beginning in 1918 too, one would only need to question systematically former prisoners and their wives. Maybe there are and were Bluecaps who never stole anything or appropriated anything for themselves, but I find it impossible to imagine one. I simply do not understand, given the Bluecaps' philosophy of life, what was there to restrain them if they liked some particular thing? Way back at the beginning of the 30s, when all of us were marching around in the German uniforms of the Red Youth Front, and were building the first 5-year plan, they were spending their evenings in salons like the one in the apartment of Concordia IOC, behaving like members of nobility or Westerners, and their lady friends were showing off their foreign clothes. Where were they getting those clothes? As the folk saying goes, if you speak for the wolf, speak against him as well. Where did this wolf tribe appear from among our people? Does it really stem from our own roots, our own blood? It is our own. And just so we don't go around flaunting too proudly the white mantle of the just, let everyone ask himself, if my life had turned out differently, might I myself not have become just such an executioner? It is a dreadful question if one really answers it honestly. I remember my third year at the university in the fall of 1938. We young men of the Komsomol were summoned before the district Komsomol committee not once but twice. Scarcely bothering to ask our consent, they shoved an application form at us. You've had enough physics, mathematics, and chemistry. It's more important to your country for you to enter the nkvd school. That's the way it always is. It isn't just some person who needs you, it's always your motherland. And it's always some official or other who speaks on your behalf of your motherland and who knows what she needs. 1 year before, the district committee had conducted a drive among us to recruit candidates for the Air Force schools. We avoided getting involved that time, too, because we didn't want to leave the university. 25 years later, we could think, well, yes, we understood the sort of arrests that were being made at the time, and the fact that they were torturing people in prisons, and the slime they were trying to drag us into. But it isn't true. After all, the Black Mariahs were going through the streets at night, and we were the same young people who were parading with banners during the day. How could we know anything about those arrests, and why should we think about them? All the provincial leaders had been removed, but as far as we were concerned, it didn't matter. 2 or 3 professors had been arrested, but after all, they hadn't been our dancing partners, and it might even be easier to pass our exams as a result. 20-year-olds, we marched in the ranks of those born the year the revolution took place, and because we were the same age as the revolution, the brightest of futures lay ahead. It would be hard to identify the exact source of that inner intuition, not founded on rational argument, which prompted our refusal to enter the nkvd schools. It certainly didn't derive from the lectures on historical materialism we listened to. It was clear from them that the struggle against the internal enemy was a crucial battlefront, and to share in it was an honorable task. Our decision even ran counter to our material interests. At the time, the provincial university we attended could not promise us anything more than the chance to teach in a rural school in a remote area for miserly wages. The nkvd school dangled before us special rations and double or triple pay. Our feelings could not be put into words, and even if we had found the words, fear would have prevented our speaking them aloud to one another. It was not our minds that resisted, but something inside our breasts. People can shout at you from all sides, "You must!" And your own head can be saying also, "You must!" But inside your breast, there is a sense of revulsion, repudiation. I don't want to. It makes me feel sick. Do what you want without me. I want no part of it. Still, some of us were recruited at that time, and I think that if they had really put the pressure on, they could have broken everybody's resistance. So I would like to imagine if, by the time the war broke out, I had already been wearing an nkvd officer's insignia on my blue tabs, what would I have become? What do shoulder boards do to a human being? And where have all the exhortations of grandmother, standing before an icon, gone? And where the young pioneer's daydreams of future sacred equality? And at that moment, when my life was turned upside down and the SMERSH officers at the brigade command point tore off those cursed shoulder boards and took my belt away and shoved me along to their automobile, I was pierced to the quick by worrying how, in my stripped and sorry state, I was going to make my way through the telephone operator's room. The rank and file must not see me in that condition. So let the reader who expects this book to be a political expose slam its covers shut right now. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart. During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood, but his name doesn't change, and to that we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. Socrates taught us, know thyself. Confronted by the pit into which we are about to toss those who have done us harm, we halt, stricken dumb. It is, after all, only because of the way things worked out that they were the executioners and we weren't. From good to evil is one quaver, says the proverb, and correspondingly from evil to good. Whoever got in by mistake either adjusted to the milieu, or else was thrown out, eased out, or even fell across the rails himself. Still, were there no good people left out there? In Kishinev, a young lieutenant Gabist went to Father Viktor Shipolnikov a full month before he was arrested. "Get away from here! Go away! They plan to arrest you!" Did he do this on his own, or did his mother send him to warn the priest? After the arrest, this young man was assigned to Father Victor as an escort guard, and he grieved for him. "Why didn't you go away?" When the interrogator Goldman gave Vera Korneieva the 206 form on non-disclosure to sign, she began to catch on to her rights, and then she began to go into the case in detail, involving as it did all 17 members of their religious group. Goldman raged, but he had to let her study the file. In order not to be bored waiting for her, he led her to a large office where half a dozen employees were sitting, and left her there. At first, she read quietly, but then a conversation began, perhaps because the others were bored, and Vera launched aloud into a real religious sermon. One would have to know her to appreciate this to the full. She was a luminous person with a lively mind and a gift of eloquence, even though in freedom she had been no more than a lathe operator, a stable girl, and a housewife. Now and then asking questions in order to clarify something or other, it was catching them from an unexpected side of things. People came in from other offices and the room filled up, even though they were only typists, stenographers, file clerks, and not interrogators. In 1946, this was still their milieu, the organs. It is impossible to reconstruct her monologue. She managed to work in all sorts of things, including the question of traitors of the motherland. Why were there no traitors in the 1812 War of the Fatherland, when there was still serfdom? It would have been natural to have traitors then. But mostly she spoke about religious faith and religious believers. Formerly, she declared, unbridled passions were the basis for everything. Steal the stolen goods. And, in that state of affairs, religious believers were naturally a hindrance to you. But now, when you want to build and prosper in this world, why do you persecute your best citizens? They represent your most precious material. After all, believers don't need to be watched, they do not steal, and they do not shirk. Do you think you can build a just society on a foundation of self-serving and envious people? Everything in the country is falling apart. Why do you spit in the hearts of your best people? Separate church and state properly and do not touch the church. You will not lose a thing thereby. Are you materialists? In that case, put your faith in education, in the possibility that it will, as they say, disperse religious faith. But why arrest people? At this point, Goldman came in and started to interrupt rudely, but everyone shouted at him, "Oh, shut up! Keep quiet! Go ahead, woman, talk!" And how should they have addressed her? Citizenness? Comrade? Those forms of address were forbidden, and these people were bound by the conventions of Soviet life. But woman, that was how Christ had spoken, and you couldn't go wrong there. And Vera continued in the presence of her interrogator. So there in the MGB office, those people listened to Korneieva, and why did the words of an insignificant prisoner touch them so near the quick? And why is it that for nearly 200 years the security forces have hung onto the color of the heavens? That was what they wore in Lermontov's lifetime. And you, blue uniforms! Then came the blue service caps, blue shoulder boards, blue tabs, and then they were ordered to make themselves less conspicuous, and the blue brims were hidden from the gratitude of the people, and everything blue on the heads and shoulders was made narrower, until what was left was piping narrow rims, but still blue. Is this only a masquerade? Or is it that even blackness must, every so often, however rarely, partake of the heavens? It would be beautiful to think so, but when one learns, for example, the nature of Yagoda's striving toward the sacred, an eyewitness from the group around Gorky, who was close to Yagoda at the time, reports that in the vestibule of the bathhouse on Yagoda's estate near Moscow, icons were placed so that Yagoda and his comrades, after undressing, could use them as targets for revolver practice before going in to take their baths. Just how are we to understand that? As the act of an evildoer? What sort of behavior is it? Do such people really exist? We would prefer to say that such people cannot exist, that there aren't any. It is permissible to portray evildoers in the story for children, so as to keep the picture simple. But when the great world literature of the past, Shakespeare, Schiller, Dickens, inflates images of evildoers of the blackest shades, it seems somewhat farcical and clumsy to our contemporary perception. The trouble lies in the way these classic evildoers are pictured. They recognize themselves as evildoers, and they know their souls are black, and they reason, I cannot live unless I do evil, so I'll set my father against my brother. I'll drink the victim's sufferings until I'm drunk with them. Iago very precisely identifies his purposes and his motives as being black and born of hate. But no, that's not the way it is. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, it is in the nature of the human being to seek a justification for his actions. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses, because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification, and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social story which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. That was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity. The conquerors of foreign lands, by extolling the grandeur of their motherland. The colonizers, by civilization. The Nazis, by race. And the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evildoing on a scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. How then do we dare insist that evildoers do not exist? And who was it that destroyed these millions? Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. There was a rumor going the rounds between 1918 and 1920 that the Petrograd Cheka, headed by Uritsky, and the Odessa Cheka, headed by Dyke, did not shoot all those condemned to death, but fed some of them alive to the animals in the city zoos. I do not know whether this is truth or calumny, or, if there were any such cases, how many there were. But I would not set out to look for proof, either. Following the practice of the Bluecaps, I would propose that they prove to us that this was impossible. How else could they get food for the zoos in those famine years? Take it away from the working class? Those enemies were going to die anyway, so why couldn't their deaths support the zoo economy of the Republic and thereby assist our march into the future? Wasn't it expedient? That is the precise line the Shakespearean evildoer could not cross. But the evildoer with an ideology does cross it, and his eyes remain dry and clear. Physics is aware of the phenomena which occur only at threshold magnitudes, which do not exist at all until a certain threshold encoded by and known to nature has been crossed. No matter how intense a yellow light you shine on a lithium sample, it will not emit electrons. But as soon as a weak bluish light begins to glow, it does emit them. The threshold of a photoelectric effect has been crossed. You can cool oxygen to 100 degrees below centigrade and exert as much pressure as you want. It does not yield, but remains a gas. But as soon as minus 183 degrees is reached, it liquefies and begins to flow. Evidently, evildoing also has a threshold magnitude. Yes, a human being hesitates and bobs back and forth between good and evil all his life. He slips, falls back, clambers up, repents, things begin to darken again. But just so long as the threshold of evildoing is not crossed, the possibility of returning remains, and he himself is still within reach of our hope. But when, through the density of evil actions, the result either of their own extreme degree or of the absoluteness of his power, he suddenly crosses that threshold, he has left humanity behind, and without, perhaps, the possibility of return. From the most ancient times, justice has been a two-part concept. Virtue triumphs, and vice is punished. We have been fortunate enough to live in a time when virtue, though it does not triumph, is nonetheless not always tormented by attack dogs. Beaten down, sickly, virtue has now been allowed to enter in all its tatters and sit in the corner, as long as it doesn't raise its voice. However, no one dares say a word about vice. Yes, they did mock virtue, but there was no vice in that. Yes, so-and-so many millions did get mowed down, but no one was to blame for it. And if someone pipes up, what about those who... The answer comes from all sides, reproachfully and amicably at first. What are you talking about, comrade? Why open old wounds? Then they go after you with an oaken club. Shut up! Haven't you had enough yet? You think you've been rehabilitated? In that same period, by 1966, 86,000 Nazi criminals had been convicted in West Germany, and still we choke with anger here. We do not hesitate to devote to the subject page after newspaper page and hour after hour of radio time. We even stay after work to attend protest meetings and vote. Too few. 86,000 are too few, and 20 years is too little. It must go on and on. And during the same period, in our own country, according to the reports of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court, about 10 men have been convicted. What takes place beyond the Oder and the Rhine gets us all worked up. What goes on in the environs of Moscow and behind the green fences near Sochi, or the fact that the murderers of our husbands and fathers ride through our streets, and we make way for them as they pass, doesn't get us worked up at all, doesn't touch us. That would be digging up the past. Meanwhile, if we translate 86,000 West Germans into our own terms, on the basis of comparative population figures, it would become 250,000. But in a quarter century we have not tracked down anyone. We have not brought anyone to trial. It is their wounds we are afraid to reopen. The smug and stupid Maltov lives on at Granadovsky, number 3, a man who has learned nothing at all, even now, though he is saturated with our blood and nobly crosses the sidewalk to seat himself in his long, wide automobile. Here's a riddle not for us contemporaries to figure out. Why is Germany allowed to punish its evildoers and Russia is not? What kind of disastrous path lies ahead of us if we do not have the chance to purge ourselves of that putrefaction rotting inside our body? What, then, can Russia teach the world? In the German trials, an astonishing phenomenon takes place from time to time. The defendant clasps his head in his hands, refuses to make any defense, and from then on asks no concessions from the court. He says that the presentation of his crimes, revived and once again confronting him, has filled him with revulsion and he no longer wants to live. That is the ultimate height a trial can attain, when evil is so utterly condemned that even the criminal is revolted by it. A country which has condemned evil 86,000 times from the rostrum of a court and irrevocably condemned it in literature and among its young people year by year, step by step, is purged of it. What are we to do? Someday our descendants will describe our several generations as generations of driveling do-nothings. First we submissively allowed them to massacre us by the millions, and then with devoted concern we tended the murderers in their prosperous old age. What are we to do if the great Russian tradition of penitence is incomprehensible and absurd to them? What are we to do if the animal terror of hearing even 1/100th part of all they subjected others to outweighs in their hearts any inclination to justice? If they cling greedily to the harvest of benefits they have watered with the blood of those who perished? It is clear enough that those men who turned the handle of the meat grinder, even as late as 1937, are no longer young. They are 50 to 80 years old. They have lived the best years of their lives prosperously, well nourished and comfortable, so that it is too late for any kind of equal retribution as far as they are concerned. But let us be generous. We will not shoot them. We will not pour salt water into them, nor bury them in bed bugs, nor bridle them into a swan dive, nor keep them on sleepless stand-up for a week, nor kick them with jackboots, nor beat them with rubber truncheons, nor squeeze their skulls in iron rings, nor push them into a cell so that they lie atop one another like pieces of baggage. We will not do any of the things they did. But for the sake of our country and our children, we have the duty to seek them all out and bring them all to trial. Not to put them on trial so much as their crimes, and to compel each one of them to announce loudly, "Yes, I was an executioner and a murderer." And if these words were spoken in our country only 1/4 times, a just proportion if we are not to fall behind West Germany, would it perhaps be enough? It is unthinkable in the 20th century to fail to distinguish between what constitutes an abominable atrocity that must be prosecuted and what constitutes that past which ought not to be stirred up. We have to condemn publicly the very idea that some people have the right to repress others. In keeping silent about evil, in burying it so deeply within us that no sign of it appears on the surface, we are implanting it. And it will rise up 1,000-fold in the future. When we neither punish nor reproach evildoers, we are not simply protecting their trivial old age. We are thereby ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations. It is for this reason, and not because of the weakness of the indoctrinational work, that they are growing up indifferent. Young people are acquiring the conviction that foul deeds are never punished on earth, that they always bring prosperity. It is going to be uncomfortable, horrible, to live in such a country. End of chapter 4.